Welcome to the SAG-AFTRA Foundation's The Business Program. I'm Tangcay, Senior Artisans Editor at Variety. Before we're joined by our guest today, I just want to let you know that the SAG-AFTRA Foundation is a nonprofit organization that relies entirely on donations to provide emergency assistance and free educational programs to SAG-AFTRA artists. This conversation is made possible thanks to the generosity of our supporters. Over the past year, the foundation has given over $6.5 million in COVID relief to more than 7,000 performers. If you're a SAG-AFTRA artist and need help, please ask. And if you can, please give. Information can be found in the description of this video, and thank you for your support. Now, without further ado, I'm really excited for this panel. So it is my pleasure to introduce Harry Yoon, Dana Glauberman, and Geraud Brisson. Incredible editors with an incredible body of work between all of them. So let's just dive right on it. Hello and welcome to you all.
Hello, and thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yay. And we're still here on Zoom, but one day we'll do this in person. Really, really excited to hear your story, and thank you to the audience for tuning in. Let's just go back and hear about how you each got your start in editing. And Dana, I'm going to start with you. What's your story? Because I know you've been you've always been an avid movie goer, and you once wanted to you had an interest in photography. So tell us your story.
I did have an interest in photography. When I was a kid, I really didn't think that I was going to go into the movie business. I thought, photography, party planning. I had no idea as a kid. But excuse me, when I was probably in my early teens, I remember talking to a family friend who kind of discouraged me from going the cinematography route because I had kind of expressed a little bit of interest in that. And so I didn't really think much about it. But then when I went away to college, I went to UC Santa Barbara a long time ago. I won't say when I graduated, but I went to I was a film studies major. And, I just kind of fell into the editing world because I took one film production class, and the only thing I liked doing between writing, directing, producing, acting, being my own DP, being my own editor, the only thing that I really liked doing was going into a dark room with a little plastic butt slicer with Super 8mm film and cutting my short film together. And the reason why it resonated with me is really because when I was a kid, I loved doing jigsaw puzzles. And, it's a lot of the same. Jigsaw puzzles and film editing is a lot of the same. Jigsaw puzzles, there's only two ways to, two pieces that fit together. Editing, there's millions of ways to cut a film, but the end result is still telling a story, the best that you can. And so when I graduated, I went and did a lot of cold calling and landed my first job as a post-production assistant at a TV entertainment company called Hearst Entertainment, and put 18,000 miles on my car in 8 months, got tired of driving around, and went to my boss and basically said, I want to learn the ropes of an edit room. And he, I apprenticed from there and just kind of flourished and fell in love with it and continued on my path.
Love that story. Harry, what about for you? What's your journey?
Well, I fell in love with film and video making actually in high school. And even though I went to a small liberal arts school that didn't have a film program, I tried to practice as much as possible. I interned for filmmakers during the summer, things like that. But being the first son of Korean-American immigrants, it was really hard for me to fully commit to such a risky career path. I think the expectation for a lot of my generation of like first generation immigrants was to do something a little more stable, a little more that involved a grad school degree, and then, you know, maybe law, medicine, or something like that. And so for a lot of my 20s, there was the evidence of that ambivalence. So, you know, I eventually got into NYU film school, but then I only stayed for 1 year. And I took a leave of absence, which turned permanent. I worked for the tech industry for a while to try to make a nest egg, so that I wouldn't feel as guilty about going into an artistic career. And finally, around the time I was 30, it's around when 9/11 happened. And there was something about that event that felt like a watershed, that felt, I think for a lot of us, like it really showed me that life is short and it's so unpredictable and it's so precious. And it's what kind of convinced me to finally take the risk to really pursue a path in film. And because I had a background in technology, and because I really loved the craft of editing, and I wanted something that I knew would get me a living wage as soon as possible, just to, again, to ameliorate the fact that I was taking this risk, I chose to really pursue editing. And thank God for that, because it continues to be a process that I love, one that feels a craft that feels endlessly hard to master. And so it's deeply fulfilling. It's been a deeply fulfilling journey. Ever since I sold everything up in the Bay Area, which is where I was, moved down to Los Angeles, started off as an unpaid intern and then a PA, and then worked my way up the ladder. And I was actually an assistant for Dana on one of her films, a first assistant on a film at Universal. And it's because of editors like Dana who are further along on their journey and so generous with her time in showing me the basics of editing, but not just that, giving me an understanding of, you know, how the process by which a movie comes together, and also the political relationships and the personal relationships that are required to maintain and to nurture as a film comes together or any project comes together. It's that really valuable apprenticeship system that sort of not only gave me an appreciation for the craft, the skill set, but also, you know, who I needed to become as a person on this journey. And so I learned from Dana and so many other editors that were mentors, and over the course of time, finally got a chance to cut, and have been really, really blessed, especially in the last 3 or 4 years, because it felt like it kind of came full circle. My hesitancy and my desire was, as an Asian American immigrant, to tell those stories, and then ultimately, recently through Minari and through Shang-Chi, being able to tell Asian-centered, Asian American-centered stories. It feels like the last few years have been really a dream come true.
Love that. Geraud, what about for you? What's your story?
Well, part of it is not feeling complete. Like it has been a lot of false starts, or at least feeling like a lot of false starts along the way for me, which is why it's great to listen to my two friends and colleagues, because there's a lot of similarities, and at the same time, it's like I also started as a cinephile, as a child, and growing up, and I come from a small town in France. And the idea of working in film was not, like Harry, almost for different reasons, it was not something that accessible. But eventually, I ended up taking some film classes, and the first thing I did was editing. And for the first time in my life, and I think I was, I don't know, maybe already 21, I was like, oh, I finally know what it is to know what you want to do in life. Like, until then, I had no idea. So from there, I committed to it in a way. I applied to film school, which is why I'm in the US, because I went to USC Film School eventually. While I was learning a lot of other craft in film school, I was definitely focusing on editing. I ended up interning in a cutting room before I graduated. So my transition after that into being an assistant editor went pretty quick. On the other hand, my transition from being an assistant to be an editor, that took longer. And funny enough, I also was an assistant for Dana for 2 weeks. She was kind enough when I needed to pay my rent to have me. And yeah, so I ended up, working as an assistant for some editor like Jay Cassidy and Hughes Winborn, who were very kind to me, and I was going to edit independent film for very little money, coming back to assisting to make some money, and that took a while. And I think at some point I made the decision of not being an assistant anymore, and I think that's when I became an editor. And I think that break came in television when I went and I got hired on this HBO show called Looking, and I work with Andrew Haig, and then from there on, I felt like some foundation were put on the ground, but until I don't know, sometimes you feel they're shaky, but they're there.
I love that. And Harry, before we go back, before we talk about Dana opening doors for editors, Harry, I want to pick up on something you said about, editing Shang-Chi and Minari, but, Dana and Harry, you've both worked on Marvel projects, and editing that, talk about the challenges of editing something that you absolutely, if God forbid that ever leaks out, people also are desperate to hear that. Like, what are the challenges of working on a project or on projects that are so eagerly anticipated? People are waiting for that first clip, that first photo, and you're like, you can't tell anybody what you're working on. Dana, do you want to start?
I was going to say, Harry, you start.
Well, I think the Marvel's security practices are pretty famous by now, and so I think it definitely gives you a sense of how precious these stories are for the audience. And it's partly through their secrecy and their security, but I think, one of the wonderful things about editing a Marvel project that really struck me was how interactive the story forming process is with the Marvel audience. Ironically, there are precious and a lucky few individuals that get to be part of these preview audiences. And most feature films may have 1 or 2 previews, but Marvel feature film, I think by default has up to 5. And we actually ended up doing 6. And that's one of the aspects of the process that both surprised me and really educated me as far as like, why are these stories ultimately, when they are premiere at a theater, why do they feel so satisfying? It's because of that feedback loop that Marvel really holds precious, is to say that even if there's like 3 or 4 people in the course of a feedback session that are confused by this aspect of the main character story or a second character story, how can we improve upon it? So there's this desire to make the film with each screening like 3% better, 5% better, etc. And they really take those comments, those confusions, those likes and dislikes so seriously, and they're willing to spend a lot of time and treasure to get it to that point so that it can feel as universally understandable, as enjoyable, as engaging as possible. And so it's that process that really blew me away. Ironically, it's the opposite of secrecy in some ways that I think makes the Marvel project that satisfying when it emerges from the crucible of the editing process.
Geraud, what about for you? Let's talk about Coda, because the way that film plays with sound and silence and music, and just how it warms the heart and it leaves you with the biggest smile on your face. Talk about the challenges or the joys of editing Coda and working with Sean on this film.
Well, thank you for saying all those nice things. And where to start? Because it was a long and a short journey on Coda, because we didn't have a ton of time, and yet I think Sean and I went, like, we had to find the film in in the cutting room somehow. So that's the way I think we described it. We a lot of it we knew in the script. We knew kind of where we wanted to end, and as we got we ended up after getting all the footage and all the scene together, we realized the movie. There was a lot of movie there. we were like 3 hours. You know, it was an assembly, but it was like all scenes in there. It was 3 hours. So granted that there were a few scenes we instinctively knew we could do with that and not lose so much. Eventually, it came to a point where we had to find some ways of streaming down the storylines. And part of it was driven by, we really tried to concentrate on what story we wanted to tell. We also knew that we were in a familiar place with this coming of age story, but at the same time, what definitely interested Sean, and also I think it was my sensibility, was to recenter the conflicts with the family and not so much about Ruby's individual story. It was always about the group and the family dynamic. So doing so, that helped sort of finding direction in how to shape the movie into an experience that was a little bit of a Trojan horse in a way, where you thought you were going to see this film and we wanted you to feel invited in seeing this story. But inside that story, we were asking you to meet people you may have not met often. We were asking you to be spending time in conversation between those people that you may not be used to in a way, because there was going to be a different soundscape in during those conversations. And this is where we started thinking, I think all the thinking about sound and the reflection about sound came in, because the way I think Sean had already mapped that in the script, the way we alternated scenes with music, scenes with conversation, scenes in ASL, was very strategic in a way. Or as we realized it as we were working through it, it became very strategic to say, okay, we bought some time here that we're gonna invite our audience now to be in that scene, and we will not use score, even though some people will ask us to use score in that scene. Probably we're gonna push away from that, because there will not be score in a scene where people will be talking with their voice. And build the experience around what Ruby's experience was also of the world. And as a coda, she was very attentive to every signs around her, and she had to juggle both the hearing world and the non-hearing world. And we wanted you to also, I think we wanted the beginning, for instance, to feel like we were going to bring in one sound after another when we start the movie underwater, because we wanted the audience to pay attention to sound, even though they may maybe not realize it, and find those moments throughout the film where you will notice sound and make sure that it would be textured enough that when we took all that away, eventually you would realize it in a different way, than just. So that, I don't know if I answered all your questions, but that's some of the answers, maybe.
Yes. No, you absolutely did. And obviously, you talk about the collaboration with Sean as a director. And, we know how important that is to editors, the director-editor relationship. And that's the key to any successful film, but or project. What about the relationship between directors and actors? Are you starting to see the shift there of actors coming into the editing bay, or, chatting you over Zoom, asking about scenes and your work? Like, talk about that if you've seen a shift.
I haven't
Dana?
really had any actors ask me directly to come into the cutting room. Directors, the directors will, if they feel comfortable and want them to be a part of it, the directors will often ask the actors to come in. And, some actors are really comfortable watching themselves, other actors are not. But I think it's a good sort of exercise for the actors to come in and see their performances, see if they're, if, I mean, as editors, we cut around a lot of stuff and we try and make you look the best that you can look, whether it's, you are wiping your face because you have an itch on your nose, or you're blinking your eyes too much, or, you're twitching or stuttering or whatever the case may be. We try and cut around all of that. So actors might remember certain things in a certain way. And then when they come into the cutting room and see how their performances can be sort of crafted and just crafted, I think is a really good exercise. But I haven't had a lot of experience of actors that I'm actually cutting in on a project come into the cutting room and work with me or want to see anything.
Yeah.
I think I have a response that's kind of a fun story that's kind of a direct answer to your question. And then I think I have some thoughts as an indirect answer to your question. I remember the first time I was a first assistant was on Mr. Magorian's Wonder Emporium. And because Dustin Hoffman was also an executive producer on that film, he actually kind of was able to come in and we were able to show him scenes. And I just remember just freaking out at that time because like he was such a hero of mine as a performer, and as, he's just this legendary presence. And I also felt like the joy of our profession, but also like the sort of like the tragedy of our profession in some ways is because like the joy is that we get to be in the cutting room with like some of our heroes and people that we admire so much. And this, these actors are the reasons why we came to love film in the first place. And like the tragedy and like the frustration was like that we can't be fans in their presence because we have to be like pros. Like all I wanted was to take a picture with him in order to send to my mom to say like, look, if this is a legitimate career, I'm actually in a room with Dustin Hoffman. Yeah, I'm an assistant editor, but like, look, like I'm like 5 feet from Dustin Hoffman, but like, of course, that's the last thing we're able to do. And so, I really felt like the irony of that. And I think it's like, in the indirect way, I think it's that the closeness and the distance that of that moment actually kind of is an analogy for sort of how we relate to so many of your members in a way is that we're like, it's such a strange relationship. And the analogy that I might use is like, we're almost like the junior high school crush that you might have, because like we see every aspect of who you are. And like, we're like intimately studying all of your emotions, all of your craft and everything. And so we develop this like really intimate relationship where we feel like we know you, not just as performers, but as people, because we're watching, every aspect of the dailies, not just sort of like, before we're watching before action and after cut as well, because there are aspects of your performance that we might be looking for in those moments as well. And so we feel like we know you, but then like when we meet you at a premiere or something like that, you have no idea who we are. And so it's like, it's like this weird kind of like cognitive dissonance that we have. But the way that I would say that, that actors kind of visit our cutting room, even without visiting our cutting room, is I feel that what I've come to see, especially in those actors that are well aware of the editorial process, is that I see in their performance an anticipation of what happens in the editing room. And what I mean by that is that there is both an awareness of camera, meaning sort of the obvious sort of awareness, which is sort of what size are we shooting at this point, right? Is this more likely going to be a master that we'll use for blocking and positioning, right? That is often less critical in terms of performance, right? Or is it going to be, are we in that close-up that where we're going to be sort of like searching for the minute shifts in your performance that will determine the shift of a scene that we'll be using. So there's an awareness of camera, but there's also, I think, an awareness of the non-continuity of performance choices that we sometimes make to build a performance. And so there's awareness of like leaving room in order when you restart in order to cut. into that new line reading or the repeated reading. There are variations in the delivery of lines that we see really experienced actors giving us. It's almost like we're in dialogue. It's almost like that actor is telling us, like, try this. And if that doesn't work, try this. Because they know that not only does the nuance that we're looking for change within, the construction of a scene, but the nuance that we're looking for often changes after the assembly is done, and we start taking things out or moving things around. There are nuances in performances and shifts in performances that we're looking for to help recontextualize where a character is in that moment. And I think in the really experienced actors, we start to see an awareness of that and the delivery of that variation, because they know how important that is in the crafting of a performance that feels continuous and organic as those changes are made, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Did anybody want to add to that?
I would say one thing that I know that I witnessed. I was an assistant as well on this movie called Brothers, directed by Jim Sheridan, and his process was a little bit more fluid eventually with the script, and he brought the actors in the cutting room, all of them, Natalie Portman, Jack Gyllenhaal, Tobey Maguire, and discussed. At some point, there was some scene that they started talking about reshoot, and he brought them in the writing process of those. But the writing process and the editing process were very close to one another at this stage, and it was a lot of research. And they were so invested in their characters that they were full on committed to anything that James was, asking them to do. It was very interesting. I ended up at some point in Tobey Maguire's bedroom with a video camera shooting some improvisation with Jim Sheridan. That's to the point of that.
Yeah.
But,
I love that. And let's talk about, we've talked about, your respective projects. Talk about landing the perfect opening, and how long that takes, how easy or, that takes to come together. Geraud, you mentioned, the initial cut of Coda was like 3 hours long. So how did that opening come together for you?
The very opening of the movie, it's interesting because the way it started at first was just that first shot going, pushing on the boat for the longest time. It pushes on the boat and you start hearing it, Emilia Jones singing. And as you get closer, you realize this person on the boat is not only fishing, she's also singing at the same time. We had that very early on. And then toward the end, and that sounds like, it's kind of not the answer you're looking for. We had to add credits on somewhere. And there was a whole discussion about opening credit, men on end. And then we knew we were going to do it as simple as possible. With that, we didn't want to lose that feeling of like getting into the movie very quickly. So we explored. We had a lot of footage that they shot when they were out to sea. And in my mind, somehow we're stuck there. And it's funny because Sean had referred to it as well. Opening of The Sound of Music was in my mind for some reason as not that we should be compared, but as sort of one of those movies that I personally love. And the way it starts is those shots, but as well of the mountain, and one by one you bring elements, and there is even a cut in there that doesn't look. You notice the cut, and I always remember that. It's a strange. All thing is beautiful, but you notice one cut, and it's just like, oh, that's somebody made a cut here. It's not as invisible as we always think editing has to be, but it's so perfect. So thinking of this, how do we have to rearrange the beginning? and this idea of like, it's always this idea of bringing sound one by one. We build it this way, bringing a credit that way, and I think we figured a way. There was also one cut we discussed at length with Sean because you felt the cut, actually, matter of fact, which secretly I was like, yes, that's like The Sound of Music. But of course, I couldn't say that to Sean. So we eventually worked it out. So we wanted it to be super simple and bring people in a way that was relating to the environment you were going to spend time in. So.
Yeah. And
Geraud. I mean, I called Geraud after I saw the movie. I couldn't catch my breath at the end of the movie because I was crying so hard. It just hit an emotional chord to me, but I was sucked in from the very beginning of that movie. You did a fantastic job in
thank you
doing exactly what you just described.
Yeah, totally. Harry, what about for you? Like the opening for Shang-Chi, or even Minari, like, you know, with Alan Kim in the back, right? We see that landscape, and I forget that first line, but it's something like, "Oh, look at the color." I think that was the line. And
yeah, I think we're I think you find the opening and you refine the opening after you go through the process of understanding what the film is about. Ultimately, I think, and that's an evolving process, because I think, one of the things that I love about cutting a feature is that you're not only telling the story, but you're telling the audience how to watch the story in terms of pace, in terms of music, in terms of everything that you show, particularly something that starts to ground the audience's experience in, more often than not, your main character's point of view. So that's what I really love about the stakes of setting up that opening shot, is that, and I think that comes about organically, like what feels right after you have done some shaping of the movie to say, like, okay, we think have a really strong sense of where we're headed, what the strengths of the movie are, and whose perspective we really want to ground this in, and also how we want to tell the story with using all those elements that I mentioned. I think, more often than not, it is the thing that is scripted, as it was in Minari. It's like that journey from leaving the city and looking around and noticing the fact that this doesn't look like the city anymore, gives you a sense of like, oh, this is going to be, largely from a story told from the perspective of David, who's the character that Alan's playing, but also the kind of dreamy quality of the music, the way that the landscape passes by in that dreamlike way, gives you a sense of memory, gives you a sense of reverie, and tells you that this is also something remembered, that this isn't just a life that's being lived right in that moment by David, but also something that's being looked back on by Isaac as the ultimate storyteller, our writer director. And so we're looking for to give that sense of those qualities, those tonal qualities in that opening, to invite the audience to say, this is the kind of story, and this is the voice that will be telling that story.
Yeah.
More often than not, it's act one in a feature film that ends up to be worked and reworked and reworked because of the pacing that you want to introduce the audience to, and the characters that you want to introduce the audience to. So act one right out of the gate needs to be dead on to what you want to say about the film and how you want to present the film to the world, and the pacing of it and the characters need to be spot on.
Love that. So let's just go back. I mean, looking back, when you're a kid growing up, you don't always realize that editing it can be a career. But is there a sequence that stood out for you that you're like, gosh, I watched that like a million times, and now I know why, because the editing was really great. Is there a sequence or a movie that you kind of obsessed over and realized, oh, it's the editing, maybe? Harry, do you want to start?
Sure. It wasn't from childhood, but I think the sequence that really made me aware of editing was in a film by Kurosawa called Ikiru. And in the film, the protagonist, who's this kind of like paper pushing bureaucrat, is given a cancer diagnosis at the beginning of the film. And so much of the film is about him trying to find meaning in his life before he's about to die. And I remember there's this one montage of him just like letting loose, because he meets this gangster, and the gangster like loves his story and says like, let's give you the night of your life, and like takes him to all the nightclubs, and and they go to all the bars and everything. And like the way that night actually feels like a night of drinking, a night of like just letting loose, in the editing and the way that one situation dissolves into the next, and then an incomplete conversation goes into something else, and he happens to be talking to this person, and then all of a sudden he's talking to a totally different person. Then he has a hat that he's never had before. I mean, it's just like there is that feeling of like energy and verve and like, abandon. And then at the end of that sequence, he's in this sort of like late night bar, and he starts singing this old folk song about sort of loss, and about something that is like, a memory of like, of the narrator singing about something he's lost. And all of the kind of patrons quiet down, all of the sound quiets down, and it turns into this sort of like lonely, kind of tragic, and ultimately very beautiful and poignant moment. And the contrast of those things, and the working of like all of those techniques to take you from the highest of highs to kind of the lowest of lows, and to create meaning out of that, as to say like, this too has been a path where meaning isn't found for this particular character, really sort of struck me. And it not only struck me as like masterful filmmaking and the power of what cinema can do in such a short amount of time, and with these little snippets of scenes, but what the power that cinema has to teach us a truth about life and about meaning, that really blew me away. And I remember walking out of that film and saying like, oh my gosh, I want to participate in this, whatever this is what I want to sort of do for the rest of my life. And that was around college. And so that memory really stays with me.
Yeah. Geraud, what's a sequence or film that stood out for you?
Well, I mentioned The Sound of Music because it's not the sequence, but that calls off like noticing that cut. I remember this very clearly at a time where I didn't understand the process at all of filmmaking. You kind of like sort of, oh, every time I watch all this, and I never noticed any of the cut. So in a way, that's I'm gonna talk about a sequence that made me notice editing because it's masterful, I think. But there's all those other sequences that I should be quoting because I never noticed any of the cut, when all the challenges I'm sure were tremendous. But I remember watching All That Jazz, Bob Fosse, All That Jazz, Alan Himes, and it is the editor on the film. And in the middle of the movie, it's a famous scene where the character has a heart attack as he's doing a read-through of a show. And this is a scene that I watched a few times over, and the first time you notice because it is so brilliant, and then you notice all the layers that goes into it. It's like there's a musicality to the way it's being edited that goes throughout the movie, and you can see it changing at this step right there, because there's a repetitive motif in the movie, and then again it's a variation on that motif. In this scene, there's clearly a point of view, and he used all the tools, dropping sound, only using Foley, to tell you the story of this, what's going on inside, and at the same time what's going on with everybody else around him. There is also the slight change of point of view between him and his ex-wife during the scene, where she sees him, notice him. It's normally his point of view for two or three cuts, which is interesting when we always talk about building a scene around one person's point of view. But in there, for a second, you just switch plays. And the whole, I mean, it's brilliant that the way it's symbolized, like he breaks the pen at the end, just to see that something happened inside, and it's all exteriorized in that moment. And yet you never see the heart attack. It cuts before he actually has it. So there's an ellipsis at the end of this. And I felt like in there, it's all the thing you can do. If you think, for me, it was like, oh, look at everything is up for grab. You can, as long as you tell the story, you can use all those tools, and everything is in that. And I think it's brilliant.
Yeah. Dana, what's your movie or sequence?
Well, like I said, there wasn't anything. I mean, growing up, I didn't know that this was going to be the career path that I followed. So I didn't know what editing was until I got to college. But, I have my favorites as a kid. They're, Sound of Music, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, all those kind of classic films, E.T., those all sort of, had an impact on me in some way or another. And I would watch them over and over and over again. But in terms of editing, it kind of is going off topic a little bit, but continuity, when people, this is totally going off of subject, but when people actually complain to me about continuity issues with, the glass was half full and then the glass was full on the next time you see somebody, or, a full cigarette and then a half a cigarette and then a full cigarette and whatnot, I always say to them, did you ever notice the sandwich in When Harry Met Sally in the famous scene when she's sitting in Katz's Deli in New York and she has a turkey sandwich in her hand, and one shot, there's a bite taken out of the turkey sandwich on one side. The next time you see her, that bite is back in, but there's a bite taken out of the other side of the sandwich. And then the next time you see her, there's a bite taken out of the middle of the sandwich and the two ends are there. But continuity, that I think a lot of editors sort of focus on continuity. But if you're into the story, or I should say a lot of editors, they focus on continuity, but but audiences find it more distracting, but we go for performance. If there's a great performance in one take and it doesn't match the next take in terms of what they're holding in their hands, so be it. Because if they can do it in When Harry Met Sally, we can do it in any movie. Totally off topic, but.
No, for sure.
Sorry.
No,
you guys know that.
No, that is incredible. That's incredible. I noticed that, but like you said, there is actually a website too that has like movie gaps and stuff. But if you go through that and you look at the performances are far more superior than, well, her shoes were brand new and one shot and the next they're like scuffed underneath, and that performance is still great. So Dana, you shed such great light on that. But this was an incredible conversation and I wish we could go on, but sadly we have to wrap. So, Dana, Harry, Geraud, thank you so much for that incredible conversation. Thank you to SAG-AFTRA and of course our audience for tuning in today. So thank you all.
Thank you again for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.